Ji-woo pressed her face against the cold metal of the transport ship window and watched the massive space station grow larger in front of them. Nexus Prime looked like a giant spinning wheel made of silver and glass floating among the stars. Thousands of lights blinked on its surface, and small ships moved around it like busy insects. "First time seeing the Academy?" asked Tae-min from the seat next to her. Her older brother always tried to sound calm, but Ji-woo could hear the excitement in his voice. "It is bigger than I thought it would be," Ji-woo said quietly. She kept her voice steady even though her heart was beating fast. The Cosmic Defense Academy was the most important school in the galaxy. Only the best students from each world got to come here. So Young leaned over from across the aisle with her datapad in her hands. "The station has 47 levels and houses over 10,000 students from 62 different species," she said, reading from the screen. "The gravity is set to standard galactic, which is close to Earth normal, but some areas can be adjusted for different species needs." Min-ho looked up from the engine part he was studying. "I heard they have workshops with tools we have never seen before. Technology from worlds that learned to build things millions of years ago." Hye-jin, who sat at the front, turned around to face them. "Remember, we are representing all of humanity here. Every move we make will be watched. Every mistake will be remembered." The transport ship docked with a soft bump, and the doors opened with a hiss. Ji-woo followed her squad mates into the station and immediately felt overwhelmed. The docking bay was huge, with a ceiling so high she could barely see it. Beings of all shapes and sizes moved around them, speaking in languages that sounded like music or grinding metal or rushing water. A tall creature with blue skin and 4 arms approached them. It wore the uniform of an academy guide and spoke in perfect human language. "Welcome, humans. I am Guide Nethal. Please follow me to your quarters." They walked through corridors lined with windows that showed the stars outside. Other students passed them, and Ji-woo noticed how they stared. Some looked curious and others seemed annoyed. A group of large gray beings with rocky skin laughed as they walked by. "Those are Vorthak," So Young whispered. "They can lift 10 times their body weight and their skin is harder than most metals." A creature that looked like a giant spider with silver fur scuttled past them on the ceiling. Its many eyes looked down at them with what might have been amusement. "Arachne," Min-ho said under his breath. "They can move in 0 gravity better than any ship." Guide Nethal led them to a section of the station marked with human symbols. "These are your quarters. Meals are served in the main hall at Standard May. Galactic time. Classes begin tomorrow at dawn cycle. Do not be late." Their rooms were small but clean, with beds that adjusted to human size and windows that showed the endless space outside. Ji-woo unpacked her few belongings and sat on her bed. She thought about home and the long journey that brought her here. Earth had only joined the Galactic Alliance 5 years ago. Before that, humans had been alone, thinking they were the only intelligent life in the universe. When the first alien ships arrived, most people had been terrified. Some countries tried to fight, and others tried to hide. But slowly, humans learned that the galaxy was full of life, and most of it was peaceful. The Alliance offered Earth membership, but it came with conditions. Humans had to prove they could contribute something useful. They had to show they were not just another primitive species that would cause trouble. The Academy was part of that test. If human students could succeed here, it would prove that Earth deserved its place among the stars. The next morning, Ji-woo and her squad mates made their way to the main hall for breakfast. The room was enormous, with tables arranged by species. Each group seemed to have its own area, with food that matched their biology. The human table was small and sat near the edge of the room. They sat down with trays of food that looked almost like Earth meals, but tasted slightly wrong. Ji-woo picked at her breakfast and watched the other students. The Vorthak sat at a table made of stone and ate what looked like crushed minerals. The Arachne hung from the ceiling above their table and dropped food into their mouths. A group of beings that looked like living water flowed around a tank filled with glowing liquid. "Look at them all," Taemin said. "How are we supposed to compete with that?" A shadow fell across their table, and they looked up to see a massive, reptilian creature standing over them. Its scales were dark green with old scars running across its hide. Yellow eyes looked down at them with obvious displeasure. "So these are the famous humans," the creature said, in a voice like grinding stone. "I am Instructor Veltar, and I will be teaching you combat basics. From what I have heard, you are the weakest species ever admitted to this academy." Hyejin started to stand up, but Veltar waved a clawed hand to stop her. "Do not speak. I am not interested in your excuses. I have studied your species, and I know what you are. You have no natural weapons. You are not particularly strong or fast. You have no special abilities. You are average in every way." The instructor leaned down closer, and his breath smelled like sulfur. "Other species wonder why you were admitted at all. Some think it was charity. Others believe it was politics. I think it was a mistake that will be corrected soon enough." He straightened up and looked at each of them in turn. "Tomorrow we will begin fear assessment training. You will face the predators that have shaped your evolution and proved your worth. I suspect you will not last long." Veltar walked away, leaving the human students sitting in uncomfortable silence. Around them, other beings had stopped eating to watch the confrontation. Some looked sympathetic, but most seemed entertained. "He is wrong," Hyejin said quietly but firmly. "We earned our place here just like everyone else." "Did we, though?" Minho asked. "Look around. Everyone here has some kind of special ability." "What do we have?" Jiwoo had been thinking the same thing, but she did not want to say it out loud. Earth had sent its best students, but compared to the other species, they seemed ordinary. The Zenthari could read minds. The Kreeth could see in perfect darkness. The Namali could breathe underwater and in toxic atmospheres. What could humans? Do that made them special? That afternoon they attended their first classes. Physics taught by a being made of pure energy. Mathematics explained by a creature with 12 different types of eyes. History lessons about wars fought with weapons that could destroy entire star systems. In each class, the human students struggled to keep up. The concepts were not too difficult, but the other students seemed to understand everything instantly. Jiwoo watched a Zenthari student solve a complex equation by simply thinking about it. A Vorthak cadet calculated structural loads in his head faster than a computer. During combat training, they learned to use weapons designed for different species. The humans were given basic energy rifles that felt heavy and awkward in their hands. Other students wielded weapons that seemed to be extensions of their own bodies. "Your reflexes are too slow," Instructor Veltar told them as they practiced targeting. "Your aim is imprecise. Your movements are predictable. In a real fight, you would be dead before you could even raise your weapons." By the end of the day, Jiwoo felt exhausted and discouraged. She walked back to her quarters with her squad mates, and none of them spoke much. They all seemed lost in their own thoughts about whether they belonged here. That night, Jiwoo stood at her window looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth, where people were counting on them to succeed. Her parents had been so proud when she was selected for the academy. Her little sister had made her promise to bring back stories of alien worlds. She thought about Instructor Veltar and his words about fear assessment. Tomorrow they would face creatures designed to test their courage and survival instincts. Jiwoo had faced fear before in ways that most of these alien students probably never had. Earth was not a gentle world. Humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. They had learned to live with danger as a constant companion. Maybe that was what made them special. Not strength or speed or special powers, but the ability to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The willingness to face impossible odds and find a way to survive. Jiwoo touched the small scar on her arm that she had gotten during the Mumbai incident years ago. She had been just a child then, but she had learned something important about fear and survival. Tomorrow she would find out if those lessons meant anything in this place among the stars. Outside her window, the galaxy turned slowly and somewhere. In that vast darkness, other worlds spun with their own stories of struggle and triumph. Jiwoo closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would test everything she thought she knew about being human. The combat simulation chamber looked different when Jiwoo and her squad arrived the next morning. Yesterday, it had been a bright, open space with white walls and practice targets. Now it looked like the inside of a cave with rough stone walls and shadows that seemed to move on their own. The holographic environment can create any setting from any known world, Instructor Veltar explained to the assembled students. Today, you will face the predators that shaped your species' evolution. Each of you will encounter creatures from your homeworld that your ancestors feared most. Jiwoo looked around at the other students. The Vorthak cadets stood perfectly still, like living statues, but she could see tension in their crystalline features. The Arachne students hung from the ceiling, and their many eyes darted nervously around the room. Even the proud Zenthari seemed uncomfortable. Fear is the greatest enemy of any warrior, Veltar continued. If you cannot control your fear, you cannot protect others. This exercise will show me which of you have the strength to continue in this academy and which should return home to safer occupations. The instructor's yellow eyes focused on the human group. We will begin with species that have been part of the Alliance longest and work our way down to the newest members. Humans will go last. The first student called was a Vorthak named Kethron. He entered the simulation chamber and the walls changed to show a world of crystal mountains and glowing caves. A creature appeared that looked like living disease made of dark energy. It moved toward the crystal being's weakness and began to eat away at his mineral body. Kethron froze completely unable to move as the simulation showed his greatest fear. The crystalline virus that could shatter his people's silicon-based bodies was their ancient nightmare. Even though he knew it was just a hologram, his body would not respond to his mind's commands. Failure, Veltar announced. Next. One by one, students entered the chamber to face projections of their species' greatest fears. A Namali student ran screaming from a bioluminescent deep-sea horror that hunted her people in the ocean depths of their homeworld. A Kreeth cadet curled into a ball when faced with a flying predator that attacked from above with soundless wings. Some students did better than others. A Zenthari named Zephyra faced a psychic parasite that fed on mental energy and managed to fight it off using her telepathic abilities. An Arachne student used her natural agility to avoid a ground-based predator that caught spiders by vibrating their webs. But even the successful students showed obvious signs of fear. They sweated or shook or made sounds of distress. None of them seemed truly calm when facing their ancestral nightmares. Finally, it was time for the humans. Heejin went first and faced a projection of a large spotted cat with enormous teeth. The saber-toothed predator that had hunted early humans on Earth moved with deadly grace, stalking her around the simulated environment. Hyjin did not freeze like some students had. She picked up a rock and a stick, creating simple tools to defend herself. She used her intelligence to find high ground where the cat could not easily reach her. When the simulation ended, she had managed to drive the predator away through clever tactics. Adequate, Veltar said with obvious surprise. Next, Taemin faced a pack of wolves that had once threatened human settlements. He worked with the simulated environment to build a fire, knowing that most Earth predators feared flames. The wolves kept their distance and eventually retreated into the darkness. So Young encountered a massive bear that could kill a human with one swipe of its claws. She remained perfectly still, knowing that some predators would lose interest in prey that did not run or fight. The bear eventually wandered away, leaving her unharmed. Minho faced a giant spider whose bite could kill within minutes. He used his engineering knowledge to create traps from materials in the simulation. The spider became caught in a web of its own making, unable to reach its intended prey. Each human student showed the same pattern. They did not have the natural weapons or special abilities of other species, but they adapted quickly. They used tools and intelligence and tactics that their alien classmates had not considered. Instructor Veltar watched these performances with growing frustration. The humans were not supposed to do well. They were meant to fail spectacularly, proving that Earth did not deserve membership in the Alliance. But instead they were showing resilience and creativity that impressed even him. "Last student," he announced, looking directly at Jiwoo. "Enter the chamber." Jiwoo walked into the simulation area and waited for her test to begin. The environment changed to show a burning city with smoke filling the air and the sounds of conflict in the distance. She recognized it immediately as Mumbai during the siege that had nearly destroyed the city when she was 10 years old. But instead of human enemies, the simulation created something else. A massive shadow moved between the burning buildings. Something that was not quite animal and not quite machine. It had too many teeth and eyes that glowed like fire. It was fear itself given shape and hunger. The creature moved toward her with predatory confidence, expecting her to run or fight or freeze like all the other students had done. But Jiwoo did something that surprised everyone watching. She sat down on a piece of broken concrete and looked directly at the monster approaching her. The simulation predator slowed its advance, confused by this response. It had been programmed to react to fear-based behaviors, but sitting calmly was not in its behavioral database. It circled around her, looking for signs of the terror it was designed to create. Jiwoo watched the creature with the same expression she had worn during the real siege years ago. She had learned then that sometimes the only way to survive was to become invisible to danger, not by hiding, but by refusing to be the thing that predators were looking for. The monster in the simulation grew more agitated as it failed to trigger the fear response it needed. It roared and showed its teeth, but Jiwoo just sat quietly watching it with calm eyes. She had seen real monsters before, and they had worn human faces and carried human weapons. Finally, the simulation ended, and the chamber returned to its normal white walls. Jiwoo stood up and walked out without saying anything. The other students stared at her in confusion, and even Instructor Veltar seemed uncertain about what had just happened. "That was not a proper response," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Fear assessment requires measurable fear responses." "She showed no fear at all," whispered one of the Zenthari students. "I could not sense any terror in her." "Mind! Impossible!" said a Vorthak cadet. "All beings feel fear when facing death." But Jiwoo had felt fear during the simulation. She had been afraid, but not of the monster. She had been afraid of failing her squad and disappointing the people back on Earth who were counting on them. The simulated predator was just another obstacle to overcome like all the others she had faced in her life. Instructor Veltar dismissed the class, but his mind was troubled. The humans had performed better than expected, and the last student had done something he had never seen before. She had faced a fear-inducing simulation with complete calmness, as if she had encountered worse things in real life. That afternoon, Veltar accessed the human student files looking for clues about what he had witnessed. What he found made him uncomfortable. Earth was not the peaceful world he had assumed. The planet had a history of violence and disaster that made most alien worlds seem like safe gardens. Natural disasters that killed millions at a time. Diseases that wiped out entire populations. Wars that lasted for decades and destroyed whole civilizations. Humans had survived ice ages and asteroid impacts and their own attempts to destroy themselves with weapons of mass destruction. Every human alive was descended from survivors of catastrophes that would have ended most other species. They had lived with danger and death as constant companions for their entire evolutionary history. No wonder they seemed calm when facing simulated predators. But Veltar was not ready to admit that humans might be stronger than he thought. Tomorrow, he would design a more challenging test. He would find something that would break their confidence and prove that they did not belong among the elite students of the galaxy. He spent the evening researching the most terrifying creatures known to galactic science. Predators from the dark spaces between stars that fed on fear itself. Ancient nightmares that had destroyed entire civilizations before being contained or driven back into the void. Finally, he found what he was looking for. The Void Stalkers were creatures of pure predatory instinct that existed in the empty spaces between solar systems. They were drawn to fear like sharks to blood and grew stronger as their prey became more terrified. No sentient being had ever faced one without breaking down completely. There was one in containment at the Academy for research purposes. It was kept in a specialized cell that suppressed its abilities and prevented it from sensing potential prey. The creature was used only for the most advanced classes where senior students learned about the galaxy's most dangerous threats. Veltar made arrangements to use the Void Stalker for tomorrow's advanced fear assessment. The containment field would keep the students safe, but the creature itself would be real. Not a hologram or simulation, but an actual nightmare made flesh. The combat chamber felt different when the students assembled the next morning. The air itself seemed heavier, and there was a strange smell like ozone and old metal. Instructor Veltar stood at the center of the room with an expression of anticipation on his scarred face. Yesterday's exercise was merely preparation, he announced to the gathered students. Today you will face something far more challenging. A creature from the deep void between stars that represents the ultimate test of courage. Ji-Woo noticed that several senior instructors had gathered to observe this lesson. Commander Thessara herself stood at the viewing platform above the chamber. The Zenthari director rarely attended basic training sessions, which meant this was something special. The Void Stalker is not a simulation, Veltar continued. It is a real predator that feeds on fear itself. The containment field will protect you from physical harm, but you will experience true cosmic terror. Those who cannot maintain their composure will be removed from the academy immediately. Murmurs of concern spread through the student groups. Even the confident Vorthak cadets looked nervous, and the Arachne students clustered together for comfort. This was clearly beyond anything they had expected to face during basic training. The creature will be released into the chamber for exactly 5 minutes, Veltar explained. You must remain standing in your designated positions. Anyone who breaks formation or attempts to flee will fail this exercise permanently. The instructor activated controls on his wrist device, and sections of the chamber floor glowed to mark where each student should stand. The positions formed a wide circle around the center of the room, with humans placed directly across from the containment unit. Ji-Woo took her assigned position between Tae-min and So-young. Her brother moved slightly, closer, offering silent support, while So-young checked her datapad nervously, reading everything she could find about Void Stalkers. These creatures hunt in the empty spaces between solar systems, So-young whispered. They are attracted to fear and feed on terror to grow stronger. No recorded encounter has ended without complete psychological breakdown of the prey. Minho swallowed hard and gripped his hands together to stop them from shaking. Why would they test us with something this dangerous? Because someone wants us to fail, Ye-jin said quietly. Her voice was steady, but Ji-Woo could see tension in her squad leader's shoulders. The containment unit at the center of the chamber began to hum with energy. Warning lights flashed around its base, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Whatever was inside was waking up. Containment field active, announced a mechanical voice. Subject conscious and aware. Beginning release sequence. The front of the containment unit dissolved like mist, revealing the creature inside. Ji-Woo's first thought was that it looked like darkness given shape and hunger. The Void Stalker stood, 12 feet tall, with a body that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its limbs were too long and moved in ways that hurt to watch. Multiple eyes of different sizes covered its head, and each one glowed with malevolent intelligence. The creature's presence filled the chamber with an almost physical weight of dread. Jiwoo felt her heart rate increase, and her breathing become shallow. Around the circle, other students began to show obvious signs of distress. Several Namali cadets started making high-pitched keening sounds. A Kreeth student's exoskeleton began clicking rapidly in a stress response. The Void Stalker turned its multiple eyes slowly around the circle, examining each potential source of fear. Its nostrils flared as it tested the air, searching for the terror it needed to sustain itself. When it found a particularly frightened student, its attention focused like a predator selecting prey. A young Vorthak cadet named Morthek could not control his fear response. His crystalline body began to resonate with a high musical note that indicated extreme stress in his species. The Void Stalker immediately turned toward him and took a step in his direction. The creature's movement caused several other students to step back instinctively. This only attracted more of its attention as fear spread through the group like a virus. The stalker's eyes began to glow brighter as it fed on the growing terror in the room. Instructor Veltar watched with satisfaction as his plan unfolded. The humans were showing the same fear responses as every other species. Taemin had moved protectively in front of his sister. So-young was calculating escape routes on her data pad. Minho was looking desperately at the chamber's exits. But then, the Void Stalker's primary eyes locked onto Jiwoo, and something unexpected happened. The creature stopped moving and tilted its head in what almost looked like confusion. It had sensed something in her that it did not recognize. Jiwoo stood, perfectly still, looking directly back at the alien predator. She felt the fear that it projected like waves of cold water washing over her. Her body wanted to run or fight or freeze, but her mind remained clear. She had learned long ago that fear was just information to be processed, not a command to be obeyed. The Void Stalker took a step toward her, expecting to find the rich terror that usually surrounded potential prey. Instead, it encountered something it had never experienced in eons of hunting across the void between stars. Here was a being who acknowledged fear without being controlled by it. Jiwoo did not see a monster from beyond the stars. She saw survival and death, and the hunger that drove all living things to continue existing. She had met these things before in the burning streets of Mumbai when she was 10 years old. She had watched friends die and learned that sometimes the only choice was to remain still and let danger pass by. The creature sensed her memories without understanding them. Images of warfare and disaster and human beings choosing to endure rather than surrender. It felt the weight of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and their own repeated attempts at self-destruction. Every human alive was descended from survivors of catastrophes that should have been extinction events. For the first time in its existence, the Void Stalker encountered prey that had already made peace with death. Jiwoo's gaze held no defiance or challenge, just calm recognition. She had stared into the abyss before and learned that it was not as frightening as the cruelty that humans could show to each other. The predator from beyond the stars found itself facing something alien to its nature. It had evolved to hunt beings who responded to terror with predictable behaviors. Flight or fight or freeze were all reactions it could use to locate and consume its prey. But Jiwoo offered none of these responses. Instead, she stood quietly and waited to see what the creature would do. If it killed her, then she would die as she had lived with dignity intact. If it chose to leave her alone, then she would continue her mission to prove that humanity deserved its place among the stars. The Void Stalker took another step toward her, then stopped again. Its multiple eyes studied her face, searching for some sign of the fear it needed to feed upon. But Jiwoo's expression remained calm and steady, as if she were looking at any other alien student in the academy. Around the chamber, other students watched in amazement as the nightmare predator seemed to hesitate. This was not how encounters with void stalkers were supposed to proceed. The creature should have identified its prey by now and begun the feeding process that would reduce its victim to a gibbering wreck. Commander Thasara leaned forward on the observation platform, focusing her telepathic abilities on the scene below. What she sensed from the human student shocked her. There was fear present, but it was controlled and managed like a tool, rather than an overwhelming emotion. More surprisingly, she detected something that might have been compassion. The Void Stalker circled around Jiwoo slowly, as if trying to understand what it was seeing. Its predatory instincts told it that this small being should be easy prey, but its ancient intelligence recognized something deeper. Here was a survivor who had endured trials that would have broken most other species. Gradually, the creature's aggressive posture began to change. Its claws retracted slightly, and its glowing eyes dimmed to a less threatening level. The waves of terror it projected into the chamber weakened as it redirected its attention away from feeding and toward understanding. Other students noticed the change and began to relax slightly. The oppressive weight of dread that had filled the room lifted enough for them to breathe normally again. Several cadets who had been on the verge of panic managed to regain their composure, but the most shocking moment came when the Void Stalker slowly lowered its massive head in what could only be described as a gesture of respect. The ancient predator that had terrorized countless civilizations across the galaxy was acknowledging something in this small human that it had never encountered before. Jiwoo continued to meet its gaze without flinching or backing down. She nodded slightly as if accepting the creature's recognition. Two survivors acknowledging each other across the vast gulf between species and stars. The stalker retreated to the far corner of the containment field and settled into a resting position. It continued to watch Jiwoo, but made no further aggressive moves. The feeding frenzy that should have consumed every being in the chamber never materialized. "Time limit reached," announced the mechanical voice. "Beginning containment sequence." The containment field solidified around the Void Stalker, and it vanished back into its holding cell. The Academy's communication networks buzzed with activity for hours after the Void Stalker incident. Students from every species gathered in small groups whispering about what they had witnessed. Within the first hour, 3 different versions of the story were already spreading through the dormitories. Jiwoo found herself at the center of attention she had never wanted. As she walked through the corridors, other students stopped their conversations to stare at her. Some looked at her with new respect, while others seemed suspicious, as if she had somehow cheated during the exercise. "Is it true that the Void Stalker actually bowed to you?" asked a Zenthari student named Kyloth as Jiwoo sat down for dinner in the main hall. "It lowered its head," Jiwoo replied carefully. "I do not know if that means the same thing as bowing." The Zenthari's large eyes studied her intently. "I was monitoring the telepathic frequencies during the exercise. The creature's mind was completely alien, but I sensed something like recognition. When it looked at you, how is that possible?" Jiwoo picked at her food, trying to think of how to explain something she did not fully understand herself. "Maybe it saw something familiar. All living things want to survive." More students gathered around their table, drawn by curiosity about the human who had faced down the galaxy's most feared predator. An Arachne cadet skittered down from the ceiling to get a closer look, while several Vorthak cadets approached with their heavy, crystalline footsteps echoing on the floor. "My species has legends about the Void Stalkers," said the Arachne student in her musical voice. "They are supposed to be the ultimate predators that feed on terror itself. No being has ever faced one without complete mental breakdown. Yet here you sit eating dinner as if nothing happened," added a Vorthak cadet. "Either our legends are wrong or humans are very different from what we assumed." Taemin moved closer to his sister protectively, but Jiwoo gestured for him to relax. These students were not hostile, just confused and curious. She could understand their reaction because she was confused too. "I was afraid," she said honestly, "but fear does not have to control your actions. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you are scared and keep going anyway. The gathered students exchanged glances as if this simple statement contained some profound wisdom they had missed. For most species, fear was an overwhelming force that demanded immediate response. The idea of acknowledging terror while continuing to function normally was almost incomprehensible. Meanwhile, in the Academy's administrative levels, Commander Thessara was having an emergency meeting with the senior staff. The Zenthari director sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by holographic displays showing data from the morning's exercise. "The readings are conclusive," reported Dr. Vental, the Academy's chief researcher. The Void Stalker was fully active and aware during the entire encounter. All of its predatory instincts were functioning normally until it focused on the human student. "Then what happened?" asked Instructor Mordeth, a veteran Creeth who had been teaching combat tactics for 30 years. "Void Stalkers do not simply choose to ignore potential prey." Commander Thessara activated another display showing psychological profiles of the human students. "I have been researching Earth's history since this morning. What I discovered is quite disturbing. The images showed scenes from human history that made even hardened military instructors uncomfortable. Wars that lasted for decades with casualty counts in the millions, natural disasters that destroyed entire civilizations, plagues that killed significant portions of the planet's population. Every human alive is descended from survivors of catastrophes that would have ended most other species," Thessara continued. "They have lived with constant danger and death as normal parts of existence for their entire evolutionary history." "But surely that would make them more fearful, not less," protested Dr. Vental. "Trauma usually increases fear responses rather than reducing them." "Not if you learn to process trauma as simply another form of information," Thessara replied. "Humans appear to have developed the ability to acknowledge fear without being paralyzed by it. They feel terror but continue to function analytically." The senior staff studied the historical data with growing amazement. Earth's timeline looked like a catalog of extinction events that somehow failed to extinguish its dominant species: ice, ages and asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions that should have wiped out complex life entirely. "How did they survive all of this?" wondered Instructor Mordeth. "By adapting," Thessara said. "When they could not overpower their enemies, they learned to outwit them. When they could not run from danger, they learned to endure it. When they could not control their environment, they learned to change themselves." Back in the dormitory levels, Ji-Woo had finally escaped the crowd of curious students and returned to her room. She sat at her small desk, writing a message to her family back on Earth. How could she explain what had happened when she did not understand it herself? Her door chimed and Hyejin entered, looking troubled. The squad leader sat on the edge of Ji-Woo's bed and stared out the window at the stars. "Instructor Veltar called me to his office," Hyejin said. "He wanted to know if you had any special training or hidden abilities that were not in your academy file." "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that you grew up in Mumbai during the siege, and that you have always been calm under pressure." But he seemed to think there must be more to it than that. Ji-Woo turned in her chair to face her squad leader. "There is no secret. I learned a long time ago that being afraid does not help you survive. It just makes it harder to think clearly." "But how did you learn that?" "Most people become more fearful after traumatic experiences, not less." Ji-Woo was quiet for a long moment, remembering things she rarely spoke about. The night when enemy soldiers had searched her apartment building looking for resistance fighters. The way her mother had held her perfectly still in a closet for 6 hours while violence raged outside. The lesson that sometimes survival meant becoming invisible to danger. "When I was 10 years old, I watched my best friend die," she said quietly. "She panicked when the shooting started and tried to run. The soldiers caught her in the street. If she had stayed hidden, she would still be alive." Hyejin listened without interrupting as Ji-Woo continued. After that, I promised myself I would never let fear make my decisions for me. Fear is just information about danger. You can acknowledge it and then choose how to respond. Most of the time, the best response is to stay calm and think clearly. But the Void Stalker was not human soldiers. It was something from nightmare designed to break minds with pure terror. Yes, Jiwoo agreed. But terror is still just an emotion. It cannot actually hurt you unless you let it control your actions. The creature was dangerous, but panic would have made the situation worse, not better. Elsewhere in the academy instructor, Veltar was alone in his office staring at human historical records. What he found challenged everything he thought he knew about strength and survival. Most species developed their courage through physical power or special abilities that gave them advantages over their enemies. But humans had survived through something else entirely. They had learned to endure conditions that should have been impossible. They had faced extinction-level events repeatedly and somehow found ways to continue existing, not through superior strength or technology, but through sheer stubborn determination to keep going no matter what. The instructor pulled up video records from Earth's recent conflicts. He watched human soldiers continuing to fight even when wounded and outnumbered. He saw civilians helping each other during natural disasters that destroyed entire cities. He observed a species that refused to surrender even when surrender would have been rational. For the first time, Veltar began to understand why the Void Stalker had hesitated. The creature fed on fear, but it had encountered a being who had already processed fear and chosen to continue functioning despite it. That was not weakness, as he had assumed, but a different kind of strength entirely. The next morning brought new challenges as word of the incident spread beyond the academy. Galactic news networks picked up the story, and suddenly Jiwoo found herself famous throughout Alliance space. The human who had faced down a Void Stalker became a symbol that different species interpreted in different ways. Some saw her as proof that humans were more dangerous than they appeared. Others viewed her as evidence that the newest alliance members might have hidden strengths. A few suggested that the incident proved Void Stalkers were not as terrifying as everyone believed. But for Jiwoo, the attention was uncomfortable and unwanted. She had not tried to become a hero or prove anything about her species. She had simply done what seemed necessary to survive a dangerous situation. "How are you handling all of this?" So Young asked as they walked to their first class of the day. Same way I handle everything else," Jiwoo replied. "One step at a time." Around them, other students whispered and pointed, but Jiwoo ignored the attention and focused on her studies. She had come to the academy to learn not to become famous. The galaxy might see her as something special, but she knew she was just a person trying to do her best in difficult circumstances. The real test would come when the initial excitement faded and people began to ask harder questions. 3 months had passed since the Void Stalker incident, and life at the academy had settled into a new routine. Jiwoo had become accustomed to the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed her through the corridors. Other students no longer saw humans as the weakest species in their class, but they were still trying to understand what made them different. The emergency alarm that sounded during morning classes changed everything. Commander Thesaura's voice echoed through the Academy's communication system with unusual urgency. "All senior students report to the main briefing hall immediately. This is not a drill." Jiwoo and her squad mates joined the stream of students hurrying through the corridors. The briefing hall was the largest room in the academy, designed to hold thousands of beings from different species. As they found seats, Jiwoo noticed that only final-year students had been called along with a few exceptional younger cadets. Commander Thesaura stood at the center of the hall with holographic displays showing a star map of the Outer Rim territories. Red warning symbols blinked around one particular system, marking it as a danger zone. 6 hours ago, we lost contact with research. "Station Kepler 442b, the commander announced. The station's final transmission reported contact with an unknown hostile force before communications went dark. Murmurs of concern spread through the assembled students. Research stations were heavily defended and protected by automated defense systems. For one to go completely silent suggested a serious threat. Long-range sensors detect multiple void signatures around the station, Thessera continued. We believe the facility has been overrun by void stalkers, a large pack of them far from their usual hunting grounds in deep space. The display changed to show the research station itself. It was a massive structure built into an asteroid with laboratories and living quarters for over 300 researchers from dozens of species. If void stalkers had attacked it, most of the inhabitants were likely dead or worse. Standard military protocol would be to seal off the system and wait for the creatures to move on, the commander explained. But we have confirmed that at least 40 researchers are still alive in the station's emergency shelters. They have perhaps 12 hours of life support remaining. Jiwoo felt her stomach tighten as she realized what was being asked. A rescue mission to a station overrun by the galaxy's most feared predators was essentially a suicide assignment. Even experienced military units rarely survived encounters with multiple void stalkers. Volunteer rescue teams will be formed from senior students, Thessera announced. This is an extremely dangerous mission, and participation is entirely voluntary. Anyone who chooses not to volunteer will face no consequences or judgment. Around the hall, students began to raise their hands volunteering for the mission. Jiwoo was surprised to see that most of the final-year cadets stepped forward despite the obvious risks. These beings had trained for years to protect others, and they were willing to put their lives on the line. Hyejin raised her hand and looked at the rest of the human squad. One by one, Taemin, So-young, and Minho also volunteered. Jiwoo knew she had no choice but to join them, even though the thought of facing multiple void stalkers terrified her. Within an hour, the volunteer teams were boarding fast attack ships for the journey to Kepler 442b. Jiwoo found herself assigned to Alpha Team, along with her squad mates and several alien students she had trained with over the past months. Their ship's pilot was Instructor Veltar, who had requested to lead one of the rescue teams personally. The plan is simple, Veltar explained as their ship entered hyperspace. Each team will enter the station through different airlocks and make their way to the emergency shelters. We extract the survivors and evacuate immediately. What about the void stalkers? Asked Kyle, the Zenthari student. How do we avoid them? We don't, Veltar replied grimly. We fight our way through them and hope our weapons are enough to drive them back. Standard suppression beams should be effective at close range. Jiwoo listened to the tactical briefing, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered the moment when the void stalker at the academy had looked into her eyes and backed away. That creature had been alone and contained. The ones at the research station would be in a feeding frenzy strengthened by the terror of their victims. The journey to Kepler 442b took 4 hours and gave the teams time to prepare their equipment and review the station's layout. Jiwoo studied the blueprints, trying to memorize every corridor and emergency exit. The research facility was a maze of laboratories and living quarters connected by narrow passages. When they dropped out of hyperspace, the sight that greeted them was worse than expected. The research station showed signs of massive damage, with entire sections torn open to space. Dark shapes moved between the twisted metal beams that had once been protective barriers. Sensors detect at least 15 void stalkers still active in the station, reported the ship's pilot. They appear to be feeding off the fear of the trapped survivors. The rescue teams split up and approached the station from different angles. Alpha Team's entry point was a damaged airlock on the lower levels near the main laboratory complex. As they suited up in their combat gear, Jiwoo checked her energy rifle and tried to control her breathing. Remember the training, Hyejin told her squad as they prepared to enter the station. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and get to the survivors as quickly as possible. They entered the station through the damaged airlock and immediately felt the oppressive atmosphere of fear that permeated the entire structure. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the air recycling system struggled to clear the smoke from damaged equipment. The first Void Stalker they encountered was feeding in the main corridor, blocking their path to the emergency shelters. The creature had grown larger and more powerful from consuming the terror of the station's inhabitants. Its multiple eyes glowed with predatory satisfaction as it sensed new prey approaching. Killith, the Zenthari student, fired the first, shot with his suppression beam. The energy weapon hit the Void Stalker center mass and caused it to stagger but did not drive it away. Instead, the creature turned toward them with increased aggression drawn by their fear. "Suppression beams are not working," Veltar shouted over the creature's roar. "It has grown too strong from feeding. We need to find another route," but there was no other route to the emergency shelters. The station's layout forced them to go through this corridor or abandon the rescue mission entirely. Other team members tried their weapons, but the Void Stalker seemed to absorb the energy attacks and grow even larger. Jiwoo watched the creature advance toward them and made a decision that surprised everyone. She stepped forward and placed her rifle on the ground. "What are you doing?" Taemin demanded, grabbing her arm. "Something different," Jiwoo replied. She walked toward the Void Stalker with empty hands and calm determination. The creature paused in its advance, confused by this unexpected behavior. It had been expecting fear and weapons and desperate attempts to flee. Instead, it faced a being who approached it with the same quiet composure it had encountered months ago at the academy. Jiwoo stopped just outside the creature's reach and looked directly into its multiple eyes. She felt the waves of terror it projected, trying to break down her mental defenses, but she had learned to process fear as information, rather than allowing it to control her actions. "I know what you are," she said quietly. "You are hungry and afraid just like everything else that lives. You feed on terror because that is how you survive. But you do not have to kill these people." The Void Stalker tilted its massive head as if trying to understand her words. It sensed something familiar in this small being that reminded it of their previous encounter. Here was the survivor who had faced death without flinching and chosen to endure rather than surrender. Around them, the other team members watched in amazement as the most feared predator in known space seemed to listen to a human's quiet words. Jiwoo continued speaking in the same calm tone she might use to comfort a frightened animal. "There are 40 people trapped in this station who have done nothing to harm you. They are researchers trying to learn about the universe just like you are trying to survive in it. You could let them go and find food elsewhere." The creature remained motionless for long moments as if considering her proposal. Its ancient intelligence weighed the strange concept of showing mercy to prey. No being had ever asked it to spare victims before. Most encounters ended in terror and feeding or death and retreat. Slowly, the Void Stalker stepped aside, clearing the corridor that led to the emergency shelters. It watched Jiwoo with what might have been curiosity as she nodded her thanks and gestured for the team to continue their mission. "How did you do that?" whispered So Young as they hurried past the waiting predator. "I asked nicely," Jiwoo replied. They found the emergency shelters and began evacuating the trapped researchers. Many of the survivors were in shock from hours of terror, but they responded to the calm confidence of their rescuers. As they led groups of scientists and technicians back through the station, they encountered more Void Stalkers. Each time, Jiwoo stepped forward and spoke to the creatures in the same quiet tone. She acknowledged their nature as predators while asking them to choose mercy over hunger.